Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think this is my cue here to kick everything off. So good afternoon. I'm Dr. Frances Robertson, the Marine Program Coordinator for San Juan County, and I would like to welcome you all here to this Science Symposium this afternoon, where we'll hear about the latest research on noise generated by Navy jet aircraft on marine and terrestrial environments of the San Juans, Salish Sea and Olympic Peninsula region. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Coast Salish people and cultures of this special region. Let us acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral lands and waters of the Coast Salish people who have called this place home since time immemorial. And let us honor inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights that have been passed down from generation to generation. This afternoon's event is co-hosted by the San Juan County Marine Resources Committee and Western Washington University's Salish Sea Institute. The San Juan MRC is very grateful to the Salish Sea Institute's support for providing the online platform and running today's events. And I'd also like to make a special thank you to the chair of our MRC committee, Christina Coons, for really spearheading the planning of this event. For those of you not familiar with the Marine Resources Committee, it is one of 7 in the counties surrounding the northern straits of Puget Sound and the Salish Sea here in Washington state. These citizen advisory committees are overseen by the Northwest Straits Commission and were created to protect and restore the marine waters, habitats, and species of the Salish Sea with the goal of ecosystem health and sustainable resource use. 5 of these 7 counties, including Jefferson, Clallam, Skagit, Island, and San Juan, are acoustically impacted by the noise generated from the Navy Growler jets originating from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. Today, we will first hear from the authors of the recent studies discussing the impacts of military overflights on the wilderness landscapes of the Olympic Peninsula and on the audibility of military jet noise in air and underwater near Whidbey Island, with particular consideration for the endangered southern resident killer whale and the endangered marbled murrelet. And this will be followed by a moderated panel discussion. So I'd now like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's session, the director of the Salish Sea Institute, Ginny Broadhurst.
Hello, thank you, Frankie. Thanks so much for your work to put this together. I'm Ginny Broadhurst, director of the Salish Sea Institute at Western Washington University. We're happy to partner with the San Juan MRC and WWU Alumni Association to bring you today's webinar. The mission of the Salish Sea Institute is to foster responsible stewardship of the Salish Sea, inspiring and informing its protection for the benefit of current and future generations. Today, we're interested in sharing science about sound, and in particular, the sound from Navy jets. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic. We had quite a large registration for this event tonight, and I want to let you know that it is being re-recorded and will be available in a few days as the recording. So I'll be moderating tonight, and I do want to let you know also that we have a number of panelists and speakers, and we also did extend an invitation to representatives from the Navy to participate tonight, and we're disappointed that the Navy's not here. Captain Matt Arney, commanding officer at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, was invited back on January 28th and declined the invitation. An additional invitation was extended in hopes that another Navy representative or a scientist of their choosing could participate. And I wanted to just read the explanation that was provided from the Navy. Navy participation in the symposium could be problematic due to pending litigation. Additionally, the recent intent to sue by the citizens of EB's reserve on precisely the subject of your symposium has exacerbated that concern. The Navy's position on this matter is best represented by Captain Matt Arney's guest editorial that initially ran in the Seattle Times and subsequently in other publications, including the San Juan Islander. And Janine, if you're able to put the link to that Seattle Times guest editorial in the chat box, that would be great. And that was published in the Seattle Times, January 3rd of this year. So to get ready for the presentation, I just want to do a couple bits of housekeeping. Please look at your screen, and up in your upper right-hand corner, there's an option for view. And if you haven't selected speaker view, you might want to do that. It's kind of the most helpful way to see this. Maximizes the speaker, makes it easiest to follow along. On the bottom line, there is a chat box, and let's just take a second or a few seconds. If you click on the chat box, and please just write in where you are tuning in from, your town or city, so we get a sense of who all's out there. Awesome. That is great. Thanks for doing that. It's great to see where everybody's at all around the region and some outside of the region. I wanted to, you keep doing that, and I'm going to explain. I know some people had included some questions already during the registration process, and I have those questions, and we'll be working from them once we get to question time. We'll also be utilizing the Q&A box. So while we're going through the symposium tonight, you're welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box. Let's see. And also, I just want to remind everyone to keep in mind that our focus is on science and not on the litigation that's going on. We'll do our best to be objective, and I hope that you will be too. This is a very large audience, so please understand we may not get through all your questions. Quite sure, actually, that we won't be able to, because there's quite a bit already. All right, great. Well, this is still coming in. Our chat box is full of all kinds of locations where everybody's at. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for your appreciation for the event. I'm going to introduce our first presentation, and as soon as Lauren starts, we're actually going to turn the chat box off just to keep the distraction low, and then we'll maintain the Q&A box. So Lauren Kuehne is our first speaker. She's going to talk about jet noise over the Olympic Peninsula. Lauren is an environmental scientist who has trained and worked in the Puget Sound region for over a decade. She has an MS in aquatic and fishery sciences from the University of Washington. She worked at University of Washington as a research scientist until 2019. Her most recent work's been done as an independent consultant for Efficient Consulting. Her first presentation will cover research done for a paper published in Northwest Science in November of 2020. And the link for that paper was provided in the original registration materials, and we can make it available again later. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Lauren.
Okay, can you hear me? It says I'm unmuted, so I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen, and it should work. Okay, great. Well, I get to kick things off. So yes, thank you, Ginny, and thank you to everyone that is involved in organizing this symposium. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share a project that has been for at least 4 years in the making. So yes, my name is Lauren Kuehne, and I worked at the UW for a long time, and with Julian Olden, who is my co-author and colleague on the work that I'm going to be talking about, where we measured the impact or the extent of the noise from growler jets out on the Olympic Peninsula. Now, I mentioned this study started about 4 years ago in late 2016, but really it actually started before that. So back in 2011, 2012, Julian and I and another co-author conducted a soundscape study in Seattle. And it was done on urban lakes, and we were looking at the importance of using a GIS-based landscape metric to predict noise. And we found that yes, noise increased predictably over urban areas. And we published that study. It's available online. But the thing that I wanted to mention is that back in 2012, I was left from that study with this idea that, you know, we make trade-offs sometimes we may live in noisier urban areas and we may accept certain amount of noise that comes with that. But at that time I was left, I said, well, what happens when you have noise intrusions in places where people maybe haven't made that trade-off? And actually, Julie and I looked for several years before a research opportunity appeared. And so the take home is that, you know, for several years before the growler jets really reared their heads, I had already been really thinking on this issue quite a lot. So many people on this call, I'm sure, are familiar. The issue has sort of arisen as a factor of a few different things as the growlers have sort of increased activity in this area. And where this originated is in 2015, the US Navy they used to use Prowler aircraft, and then a 7-year transition period completed in 2015 to where they were using the Boeing Growlers, which are usually considered more powerful aircraft. Now, at the same time, there was a national consolidation of this electronic warfare Growler training to Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. And correspondingly, in 2015, and then more recently in a supplemental environmental impact statement, the Navy proposed increases in their electronic warfare training and their air-to-air combat training for the nearest military operations area, which is the Olympic military operations area over the peninsula. Now, this was 4+ years ago at this point, and at that time, the challenge that seemed to be prominent to me is that there was just no real data. You know, there had been this increase in activity, there was this new proposed increase, but there was just no way to say, you know, an increase over what? What is the current noise levels like, and are there patterns to it, you know, that we can identify? And you talk to residents, and some residents said, no, they're flying all the time, nights and evenings and weekends, and it's nonstop. And then other people said, well, we just never hear them at all. So it was just very, very difficult to have anything beyond what I would consider an emotionally based conversation. So, you know, I mean, we just said, well, I think we can go measure this. I think we can go and establish some idea of what the current noise levels are like, so that hopefully we can evaluate these increases in a more practical and empirically based way. And that's really how this project got its start. Now, I did mention that, you know, around the time that the growlers started flying, and then since that time, there has been consistent media attention on this issue, and it's just continued to grow. And this, what I've put up here, is just a small little sampling of what has been written about this issue. And I've had 4 years to ponder on this. And what is intriguing is that it's not just local and regional journals. This is appearing in European magazines and the New York Times and the Washington Post and, you know, Earther and High Country News and all of these places. And like I said, I've had a lot of time to consider, and I think it's worth thinking about and considering why that is, why this issue just won't go away. Now, the Olympic Peninsula, of course, is home to Olympic National Park, and it's home to many special and unique landscapes. Now, the park has been there since the 20s. It's a very cherished park. It has a, you know, large domestic following, but also an international following. It's a World Heritage Site. It's visited by more than 3 million people a year. So that has been there for a long time. Multiple Native American tribes, the peninsula is their home, and they have obviously these deep and longstanding cultural, spiritual, and economic relationships with both the landscapes and with the wildlife that live there. And then lastly, there are multiple residential communities that have been engaged in fishing and forestry for quite a long time. So I think that both formally through the Olympic National Park, which is 95% wilderness, and there's also these informal reasons that for a long time, the peninsula has been considered a place of really special sanctuary or escape, a place where people would go and expect to have these more remote experiences. And I think the reason this continues to draw attention is that there's a sense that we may be able to protect places from other types of impacts, but clearly not noise, right? And so I just want to put that broad context out there. Now, there's that international grandiose backdrop to this context to this issue, but in fact, the study objectives that we set out to do were very, very straightforward. And that was just to say, you know, what are the current noise levels that we measure and the contributions of different types of aircraft, commercial, military, and recreational, on this Olympic Peninsula soundscape. And then what we hoped is that by having that basic level of data, we could then talk about these proposed increases and what that might mean, for people and potentially for wildlife. So pretty straightforward objectives. This map, I'm going to show the map of our study design, and this is a map of the Olympic Peninsula. The brown shows the footprint of the Olympic National Park. And then on top of that, there's also the critical habitat for the 2 ESA listed terrestrial species, which are marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl. Now the red hatching shows the position of the Olympic military operations area. It's a special use airspace. And that's where, there's another portion of the MOA that's offshore as well, but this shows the land-based portion of that MOA. Now on top of that, there's 3 blue points. That's our primary recording locations. So in 2017 and 2018, over that year, we recorded in those 3 locations in 4 seasons: spring, summer, winter, and fall. And that's because the seasonal soundscape changes. We wanted to consider, make sure that we tried to account for that. Now the orange dots are 2 locations where we monitored opportunistically in 1 season, just in the summer. And the way that we did this data collection is using what are called Wildlife Acoustics is the manufacturer. These are called song meters, and they're actually wildlife recorders. Now, this is one avenue for doing this type of data collection. We did it because the recorders are weatherproof, they're very robust, they can record a wide range of both frequencies, and they have a pretty good range of loudness that they can accommodate. So they were pretty good. We could afford to put 3 of them out simultaneously and collect data in 3 locations at one time. So in each of these times, we're recording for at least a minimum of 10 days at a time. And so that at the end of that 2017 to 2018 year period, at the end of the 1 year period, we had 40 days of audio data from these 3 primary and 2 supplemental locations. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the methods, but I do want to show you a spectrogram because it'll appear both in this talk and it'll appear in the second talk as well. A spectrogram, this is literally the data that you're looking at, the audio data. A spectrogram is just a visualization of sound data, and I'll talk through what this is. This is 1 hour of audio data that I collected out on the Olympic Peninsula, and so we see 1 hour on that horizontal y-axis. Now, frequency refers to the pitch, the highness and lowness of sounds. This is a vast generalization that I've put up here, but it's just to show you that we can kind of generally make some generalizations about what type of noise occurs at what frequencies. Human noise is considered usually low frequency noise. Most of it is occurring below 3 kilohertz or so. Then we have frogs and birds, and then insects and bats, which we can't even hear. They're above 20 kilohertz. And then color on this spectrogram is the loudness. So the cool blues are quiet things, and the pinks and the whites are loud things. And what you can see here is, some of the loudest things in this particular soundscape are the growler aircraft, which are they're really obvious. It's pretty hard to miss them. So, but this is the beautiful thing about passive acoustic monitoring. It's very high resolution. It's very detailed. You can listen to everything, and it'll easily record, individual bird calls and people talking and all kinds of sounds, right? Okay, so this is how we, hopefully that top, you can see this. This is how we actually processed the data. Again, I just want to show you, how we did this. Like the way that I like to say this is some science is rocket science. This is not, this is not that type of science. So this is the audio data. We're looking at that same, not a little less than an hour, I've zoomed in here. We're looking only at the aircraft events. You can listen to these, you can, view them in the spectrogram. And what we did, me and a team of volunteers and interns, we went through and all of those audio files, we annotated each and every aircraft event that we were able to identify, and we classified it as commercial, military, or recreational or prop planes. And from those 5 locations, we ended up with more than 3,000 hours. So we had to repeat this a lot, and we also had to go through it again and validate it. So it took a long time. But what we end up with at the end is we end up with a database. We have events. We have all the aircraft events for that 40-day period, 46-day period rather. We have duration of each of those aircraft events in seconds. We also know the exact time of the day in which those aircraft events occurred. So then we can start to analyze that information to come up and analyze what are the patterns that we're seeing in aircraft noise events out on the peninsula. Okay, so this is our first, this is the first, I have, I think, three or four result slides. This is the first one that I always show, which the question was, you know, what is an aircraft event? What can we call an aircraft event and how long does it last? I mentioned we had over 3,000 hours of audio, and from that we identified and analyzed more than 5,000 individual events. Now, what you see here is a graph of the average duration of each of these events by grouping. So we have commercial in black, we have helicopter, they're pretty rare, they're actually very rare, but we did include them. We have military events, mostly these are growlers, in the light gray, and then propeller or recreational aircraft in the dark gray. And what was really interesting is that the average duration of each of these events was quite similar, 2 to 2.5 minutes, but clearly there's a far more variability in what we can consider an event for the military aircraft. And it ranged everything from 5 seconds to 24 minutes of continuous sound. The reason I show this result first is that it just tends to permeate through every other result. So for example, when someone says to me, well, how loud is a growler? I have to say, do you mean the 10-second event or do you mean the 20-minute event? So I show this because it indicates how variable this noise is. And then it also shows you that if you want to try and compare this activity or this noise to commercial aircraft, something we're more familiar with, it's very challenging and is potentially just really inappropriate. Okay, so the next question that we were trying to answer was just, you know, well, are there daily or weekly patterns to when the military aircraft, at this point, we know it's a lot of military aircraft, so we want to know when are they flying. So this plot here, what we did is we put all the seconds of aircraft noise into a bin and then we separate them out by their type and plot them by the hour of the day. So what you're looking at is for the 40 days of sampling, the proportional contribution of each of these different types of aircraft by the hour of the day. So a couple things really jump out. I mean, for one thing, obviously the lion's share is the military, which is the dark gray in here. And then we have smaller contributions of these other types of aircraft. The other thing, obviously a big spike right around 9 a.m. And we found that on a daily basis, 75% of our aircraft noise, 75% of the military aircraft noise occurred between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. working hours. Still a healthy chunk, you know, 20% was between 5 and 10 p.m. Now weekly, 92% of what we detected and classified as military was on weekdays, and this is consistent. So Naval Air Station Whidbey Island has a, I'm not sure if it's a formal or an informal policy, but they've certainly followed this policy for a long time, which is to only operate on as needed on weekends. So the fact that we only detected mostly on weekdays was consistent with that policy. Now, when you do sort of the math, what you come up with is that the different contributions, we found that 88% of this was what we classified as military in origin, 5% was commercial, and 7% was sort of that combined prop and helicopter traffic. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking 88%, is that even reasonable? And I had this thought myself at one point, but I do want to show you why it is reasonable. So this is commercial air traffic can actually be tracked. They ping GIS-based indicators every few seconds, and there's databases out there that we can extract information to generate patterns of commercial air traffic. And a colleague made this, so hopefully you can see it up in the top. This is commercial air traffic from these GIS-based databases for the last approximately 2 weeks of time. And we can see these clear patterns emerging out of SeaTac to the east and to the west, but we know that the FAA routes commercial traffic around military operating areas or special use airspaces, especially if they're activated, which we know that this one is activated a lot. So you can see that process in this beautiful visualization that demonstrates how the commercial air traffic is actually being rerouted or routed around that MOA. So it really, you know, it suggests that the noise that we are measuring in that military operating area really is it's not very likely to be commercial air traffic for the most part. Okay, this is my last results slide for this. We were trying with these presentations to just sort of present the highlights. There's more information in the paper, but we wanted to kind of present the highlights for this and move so that we can get to the panel discussion. This last slide is kind of the same information, but we just calculated it as a percent time audible. So again, we have hour of the day, and instead of total duration on the y-axis, what we now have is percent of that hour in which the aircraft noise, military aircraft noise was audible. It's also separated in this plot by our 3 primary locations. And you don't have to worry too much about, exactly what those bars are doing, but what I want to draw attention to is that they're kind of moving in tandem. And this, we were trying to find out, like how widespread is when the noise is occurring, how widespread is it? So what we came up with was we found that on weekdays, the daytime hours, the aircraft noise was audible maybe between 10 and 20% of these daytime hours. And if you kind of sum that up, you end up with about 60 to 90 minutes of aircraft noise on training days. Now, it's not 60 to 90 minutes of time in one chunk, right? The aircraft are moving across the MOA, back kind of crisscrossing the MOA. There's multiple training sessions, usually sorties per day. And so this is occurring as abbreviated or punctuated events. What we found is that typically we could estimate about between 20 to 60 events on a training day. Someone would be likely to hear an individual aircraft noise coming and going about that many times, but it's really variable. So the maximum numbers we found were even 90 or even more than 100. So just high variability with that. And the other thing that we found is that in any given hour, we found that the aircraft noise is strongly correlated even at distant sites. Our most distant sites were 50 kilometers apart. But we know that these are fast aircraft. They're moving across large distances very quickly, and they're covering a lot of them. So the impacts are just not localized. I think, oh, right. So I did put this slide in. So this slide, I try and avoid anecdotal data, right, when I can. But these quotes from residents, these all came from quotes from people that had either read the publication or something afterwards. And I thought they were really interesting. In fact, some of them, what they found is they said, well, it was fine, like your research did an okay job, but it's really louder than that. Or I shouldn't laugh, it's not funny. It's funny that they said that I didn't get it right because it didn't capture the full variability, right, that they're experiencing. Or, this top quote, it's just, you didn't really capture how disruptive this noise is to us, right? And then there's another quote that suggests they're saying, that it's intermittent, right? They're capturing that intermittent nature of that noise and how in some ways that makes it more difficult. So these quotes from residents, I think they're just to illustrate that, yes, the noise is occurring, and yes, it is impacting people. Okay, so just a summary of the sort of take-home messages from this is we found that military aircraft currently are sort of the majority of human noise out on the peninsula in the MOA. And so what the decisions that the Navy makes are probably going to be the primary driver of this kind of regional soundscape in the future. The noise is concentrated during daytime hours, but it's really variable. I mean, I personally experienced some days it's a half an hour and some days it's 2 or even 3 hours coming and going throughout the day, right? So very highly variable. That makes it difficult to characterize. The geographic, it's widespread, pretty widespread on the landscape. And then it is loud. Sometimes it can be really loud. And the Navy's own noise analysis, suggests that depending on elevation, the maximum noise levels are going to be between 82 and 100 decibels. Most of it is not the maximum, right? Most of it is the lower level noise. But our data, so some of it can be surprisingly loud, but our data sort of suggested that probably the impacts are probably due to more that it's chronic. It's pretty much most weekdays, it can go on for quite a while, and it's intermittent and variable, it comes and goes. And then the last thing is just that, our original intention with this is that we hope that by having these basic information, we could then start to ask, how can we mitigate some of these how could we even evaluate some of these impacts? And then potentially, how could we mitigate some of them? So I have more information. I have a website. You can email me, get in touch about anything that you like. I try and get to my email. I have a longer version of this same presentation on YouTube, and you can get to that via my website. You can follow Julian and I both on Twitter if you like. And then I just acknowledge some project funding that we received for this study. And that is all that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen sharing, which I believe is what Janine told me to do.
And I'm going to come on for a minute. There's a couple questions that came in that I think are pretty quick. So I'm just going to run those by you. What kilohertz is the mighty EA18G growler?
Oh, yeah, so we studied that. We found that most of the growler noise is occurring between below 2 kilohertz. It's actually closer to 1.4 kilohertz. So most of it is low frequency noise. And the vast majority of the noise signatures that we found impacted was up to 1.4, but we could round it up and call it 2. So.
And another person notes that growlers typically operate in groups of 3 aircraft. Can you differentiate your results based on the number of aircraft being measured?
No, I mean, this brings up an interesting research question. I hardly ever see them. I hear them a lot, but there's clouds, there's trees, right? They're also flying at high enough elevations you wouldn't necessarily always spot them. So there's no way that I know of to sort of differentiate the number of aircraft or even to sort of do visual confirmation of this type of data, unfortunately. The Navy has the schedules, right? I mean, they can pair that stuff, but.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So we're going to bring out I'm going to ask our panelists to turn on their video, and I'm just going to quickly share with you who we've got with us. Dr. Rob Williams is a marine conservation biologist at Oceans Initiative. He does a lot of work with sound and marine mammals. And I'm going to let Rob tell us a little bit more about himself, and then we'll just quickly go through each one of the panelists, and then we'll open up a conversation.
Sure. No, that's true, Ginny. My wife, Erin Ash, and I co-founded Oceans Initiative to do marine conservation science. We do a lot of work on southern resident killer whales, a lot of work on trying to reduce bycatch of marine mammals in fishing gear, and build capacity for folks trying to do science with lower budgets in countries with fewer resources than we have here in North America. Most of my work has been on the effects of boat noise and ship noise on killer whales, humpbacks, belugas, and now a few species of fish like herring and salmon. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. And Rob's going to be presenting along with Lauren a little bit later. Next up is Edmund Cito, who comes to us from University of Washington and is going to bring a human health perspective to our discussion. Edmund, welcome.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, Edmund Cito, and I'm in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. And my experience is mainly around exposure assessment or exposure sciences. So I measure what people are exposed to. Most of my work actually isn't on noise, but it's on air pollution. For a number of reasons, whenever we start looking at air pollution, noise starts to crop up. And so usually it used to be in the context of roadway traffic. Whenever we look at roadway traffic related air pollution, people talk about noise pollution, co-exposures. And these days, increasingly, we've been looking at aircraft related air pollution. It's a thing. And then once we start talking about aircraft air pollution, people start asking about the co-exposures with noise. And so we've been looking at a lot of health impacts, human health impacts of noise in the Seattle, South King County area around SeaTac airport specifically. So looking forward to participating in the panel.
Great, thank you. Todd Haas is next, and he is at the Puget Sound Partnership. He was involved in the Governor Inslee's Orca Task Force, who has some focus on orca health. Todd, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Ginny. I'm glad to be with you all. I'm the special assistant to the director at the agency, and for 2 years I led the Vessels Working Group for the Orca Task Force, and we produce recommendations for how to reduce vessel disturbance and noise, and highlighted the likely need to work with the Navy on better understanding and potentially mitigating noise and disturbance from their jets. I studied seabirds and animal communication for my PhD, and so I'm interested in today's exchange from those angles too. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And next is Michael Jasny, who's coming to us from our neighboring country of British Columbia. I'm particularly happy to have someone from across the border with us. Michael deals with these sound issues, and he works for Natural Resources Defense Council. Michael.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I'm based in Vancouver, BC. I direct NRDC's Marine Mammal Protection Project, and I've been working on underwater noise issues for more than 20 years. My background is more on the law and policy side, and my work has consisted of litigation, including multiple pieces of litigation challenging Navy activities in the underwater environment and their impacts on marine mammals. Litigation in other sectors as well, involving oil and gas exploration, for example. I've also do lobbying on this issue, participated in technical and stakeholder bodies, have been involved in many ways in policy development on underwater noise over the years, and very interested in all the thoughts of my co-panelists today. Really good to be here.
Great, thank you, Michael. I'm going to throw a question to Edmund, actually, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to start asking each other some questions. I actually looked up, I was thinking, I need to look up the difference between sound versus noise. Noise is unwanted sound. So when we use that word noise, it's actually somewhat subjective. Is there a more technical definition that we have for when sound becomes noise?
No, that's the definition that I often use. You know, sound, it could be music, it could be pleasant, it could be wonderful. Noise is unwanted. It's a nuisance. And so
and as we know with music, one person's music is another person's noise. But and then maybe
those
from
days of the grunge era and annoying my parents.
But from a health standpoint, is there must be a threshold then where it starts to become impactful.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I'm looking off the side of my screen at the QA box. You know, it's a fairly sophisticated audience that we have here. And so, you know, I think a lot of what we would consider to be noise is common sense, things that people can relate to. So sometimes it's the frequency. So if you think of the blaring car alarm in the middle of the night, it's in the middle of the night, and that's why it's unwanted and it's disruptive. If we're thinking about the Olympic Peninsula, which is typically very, very quiet and pristine and has a lot of nature sounds, but then it's suddenly interrupted by, you know, the growl of a jet engine passing by, which is, you know, 100 decibels or louder. I mean, that's sort of incompatible with the environment that you're in. So again, unwanted noise, just two examples.
Thank you. Panelists, do you have want to propose a question to each other, or shall I keep? I definitely have a lot from the audience, so I'm trying to keep up with that. But if you want to pose, Lauren.
Sure.
Lauren.
So I think my question is probably aimed at maybe, well, probably Edmund and then Michael, depending. So if noise is, noise is unwanted sound, but I myself have struggled with identifying what are considered legal thresholds. Like, my own understanding is that we have very few, at least in the United States, we don't really have that many ordinances or legal thresholds where you say this is now too noisy. I mean, there's the FAA, and that's noise around commercial airports. There's a little bit of local ordinances, right? But that's kind of it. And I think what I've experienced when talking to folks about this is I think that we suspect that there are more thresholds than there actually are. So then when we start to say, well, this is clearly too noisy, it's like, well, legally it's not. So I was just wondering, Edmund, do you have more information about these ideas of thresholds of noise where things become legally too noisy, right? And Michael, you may as well too.
Yeah, I'll chime in and I'll let Michael take over. You know, you mentioned commercial aircraft and city ordinances. You know, usually when we talk about commercial aircrafts, people talk about, you know, these noise studies that the airports are supposed to do for FAA. And they develop these noise contour lines around aircraft where, you know, within those contours, mitigation needs to be conducted. And so, for instance, SeaTac, that's what happens. There's a noise contour map. 65 dBA is the threshold, but it's for a specific kind of noise metric. And so, as you mentioned, Lauren, depending on the timing of, you know, are you looking at a 1-second noise measurement or a 24-hour noise measurement? You know, all that variability gets factored in. And so if you've got a commercial aircraft, commercial airport, you've got a lot of air traffic coming in. And so they'll generally look at something called an LDN, or a 24-hour noise measurement with a 10 dB penalty on nighttime hours. That makes sense, I think, for a commercial aircraft airport, because you've got aircrafts coming in at all hours of the night. But if you have very kind of strange patterning of noise, then maybe that's not the right metric. And so I think that maybe some of the issues around, you know, it's expressed in some of the quotes that you put up in your presentation, is that it's episodic, it's hard to predict. And so in those cases, maybe LDN isn't the right metric to use, let alone those thresholds around LDN. So I'll pause there and see if Michael has things to add.
Yeah, thanks. I would say that, yeah, there are, as Evan is saying, a number of metrics out there in for both in air and in water noise as well. But those metrics and those schemes have a lot of gaps to them. So, you know, for example, another way in which civil aviation noise is managed is under or through an international convention and a body called the International Civil Aviation Organization. And since the, I think, late 60s, early 70s, it has set noise output standards for commercial planes, inspired by health effects that were beginning to be observed by or in residents around Heathrow Airport and some other airports around the world. Those limits, which govern new builds of new planes, are limited to civil aviation. They don't apply to military planes. In the underwater context, we have thresholds above which a sound is considered to be what's known as a take under federal law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and can therefore be subject to mitigative actions by one or another of the federal wildlife agencies. Problem there is that we don't have a definition of or a threshold constituting take from noise from any airplane, and indeed the wildlife agencies assume that noise from planes by and large will not have an effect at all on marine mammals when they are underwater. The only time when this becomes relevant to the agencies is where planes are flying low over rookeries for seals and other pinnipeds, and in that case you see some agency action. But you know, here too we have a threshold that exists in theory for, or should exist for noise from commercial and military planes, but in practice does not exist. Anyway, and there's a lot more that can be said. There's just, I think as both Edmund and I are getting at, there are just a lot of gaps, technical, jurisdictional, and otherwise.
Thank you, Michael. And some of the questions coming in and some of the points that you raise actually are kind of bringing us to a segue of perhaps to the next presentation about noise and what happens when underwater related to that noise. But before we go to a presentation, we actually have a couple polling questions for the audience. And I wonder if Janine could pull up the first one of those. And we're going to do a quick poll. Here you go. Just to find out from you all, where do you live? Quick, 30 seconds, fill it out. We'll get some information. There is a lot of interest in health effects around noise. I can see coming in. We're going to have a hard time keeping up with all these questions, I realize. And Lauren, are you going to be ready here in a moment?
Oh, yes, I will get ready.
Okay, so we've got, really pretty interesting distribution. I wish we had actually specifically said if they're in Canada. We sure know that noise travels across the border. And boy, those Gulf Islands are sure close to the San Juans, aren't they? So these issues are shared. Cool, thanks. Okay, we are going to hear from the rest of our panelists when we come to another round of Q&A and discussion, but I think I'm going to let Lauren start up the next presentation. That's a slightly different focus around Whitney.
Okay, I will try doing this screen sharing again. So I know that Rob and I drew straws on who would do this presenting, and it turns out that I had more childcare and more time to prepare, which is a sad statement in and of itself, but we'll go with that. And so Rob's going to join in at the end and talk. So I'm going to do the bulk of the presenting, and then Rob will join at the end and just say what I missed or didn't say right or that kind of thing. So, oh no. Uh-oh, sorry, I can't get to my slideshow. Oops. Okay, should be seeing the presentation now. Anyone give me a thumbs up? You're good? Okay, excellent. Okay, great. So this was a second study that oddly enough, so scientific publishing is a crazy thing. The other study started in 2016. This study started much later, but they actually were published in the exact same time. And I joined in, so this co-author group that I'm representing and speaking for today includes Christine Erba, Erin Ash, Laura Bogard, and Morena Collins, and Rob, of course. Rob and folks at Oceans Initiative have collaborated with Christine in the past on underwater noise. And this was my opportunity to work with them to sort of try and integrate these two ideas. For the most part, underwater noise and terrestrial noise are typically studied in isolation for many good reasons, but we saw an opportunity to try and integrate those two ideas a bit more because we know that noise is not just impacting one dimension, right? It's impacting multiple dimensions of the environment at the same time. Okay. Now, there's a little bit of background some knowledge gaps that we saw an opportunity to try and fill collectively. Now, military operations and noise impacts from those operations are one of the least studied environmental noise sources for good reasons. It's far easier to encounter a commercial aircraft, for example, than it is military aircraft. So the operations are less frequent, less commonly encountered, even though they may be very impactful. The other part that's interesting, and this has been covered in multiple reviews, have noted this at some point, it's logistically very challenging. Schedules are not usually published ahead of time. You can't always access information about these operations. So logistically, it's just very challenging to pull off this research. So we wanted to try and advance that ball a little bit. Now, underwater noise from aircraft is actually, Michael mentioned this, it's typically ignored because due to the assumption that most of it reflects off the surface. But Rob and Christine led a 2018 study in Indonesia where they looked at intrusions of commercial aircraft noise underwater. And from that study, they concluded, they said there are situations potentially where airborne noise cannot be dismissed. And ironically, there's very few studies that have looked at underwater noise, but I and Julian did one in 2012. So back in 2012, I knew that aircraft noise also permeated underwater, but the question was how much. So collectively, we said, okay, well, we can look at this too. And then the third opportunity that we saw here is noise is often studied in what I would consider an abstract context, right? You look at the influence of noise on, say, bird communication or something, and it's really informative. But here we actually there's multiple environmental impact statements that are being done. And so we had the opportunity to study noise in a context where kind of the rubber meets the road. Like we got to see how is noise when there are actual risk assessments done for people and for animals, like how is noise considered and how is it integrated? So this was the opportunity that we saw. The study, now that said, the study design is, we were studying aircraft noise right by the military airfield. And it is, reviewers have noticed this. We're we're totally willing to acknowledge this was limited in scope, and we studied at the most extreme places where we might expect the noise to be the most extreme. Now, this map shows our data collection strategy. Here is a map of Whidbey Island. You see Altfield is the airfield in gray. And then on top of that, in those blue, those are FCLP, which are field carrier landing practice. These are kind of one of the dominant types of training that are done around Whidbey Island with the growlers. And we see 2 of those flight paths. There's others flight paths here. We only mapped 2 of them. But as you can see, the hydrophone was right underneath one of them. It was also at the end of the east-west runway at Altfield. Hydrophones are tricky to deploy, so Rob and Oceans Initiative deployed that hydrophone for a whole month. So it was sitting in the water collecting data for a month of time, and it was approximately 30 meters under the water. The in-air noise measurements, again, we get into some of that logistical challenge, right, is that the flight schedules aren't published in advance. You get some indications a few days in advance, and that probably will occur. So that makes it tricky, but we were able to record field carrier landing practice on 2 days just north of Altfield. And that was at a public location there. The way that we analyze this data set is that, we just, for the most basic information, we just said, well, we want to characterize this flight activity. How many times a day, what's an FCLP session look like? How loud is it? But we could do that, of course, both in air and underwater. The next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to place that noise in context. And so we compared our measured noise levels with thresholds that we identified in the literature, thresholds of impact that have been established by previous research on people, and then also what we considered a representative suite of different wildlife. And the idea behind that, again, is getting at that even though noise is often studied in terms of this is the noise effects on one species or one suite of species, we know that that's not the case. It's impacting an entire community. It may be impacting an entire ecosystem. So we're trying to kind of capture that information. The last part of this was to say, okay, well, this type of flight activity, the number of flights per day, the noise levels, how does that compare to other studies that have looked at the impacts of what are called military low altitude flights? So we scoured that literature and did what's called a semi-quantitative literature review to place this in context of those other studies of impact on either people or wildlife. So that was the sort of our approach. Okay, all right, so we're gonna start looking at some results right away. This is the aircraft activity in air. So we're back to spectrograms again. Here's our spectrogram for the noise that we recorded just north of Altfield. For those that are familiar with it, the aircraft on these 2 days that we recorded would have been landing. So we were recording under the landing pattern on one of those FCLP tracks. You can see here a spectrogram. Now, spectrograms have time. That period of time that you're looking at is on that x-axis, it's 4 hours on September 13th, and it's the same 4 hours on September 16th. And each one of those little spikes is an aircraft either landing or passing over. And what you can see, there's a clear pattern here. You can see those field carrier landing practice sessions, right? They're practice sessions and they occur in chunks of time. Tend to be about 30 to 60 minutes of activity. There may be multiple aircraft operating at the same time. And so the periods of time you may have multiple, you may have aircraft going by a little bit more than maybe once a minute, or there may be minutes between those two. But either way, these sessions occur in what are sort of identifiable clusters, right? And that's apparent both on the 13th and the 16th. But even between these 2 days, lots of variability. Average loudness we found was 107 A-weighted decibels. Now, I mean, F-18s are loud, who knew, right? The maximum decibel level that we recorded on any individual flight was 118. Now, the number of passes varied on the 16th between 70 and 183 growler events, if you will, going over ahead at the same time. Since we were only recording on 2 days, we really did a lot of homework to say, well, what if we were just there on an extreme day? So there has been opportunistic monitoring done between 2013 and 2019. And we looked at both our average, the noise levels that we found, and then also the number of flights that we recorded, flight events. And they were really consistent with that previous monitoring work. So that made us confident that we hadn't been recording anything really crazy, or out of, yeah, that was unusual, highly atypical. The other thing that we did is these FCLPs were scheduled. There were 2 periods of activity scheduled on these 2 days. And so we looked at the FCLP notifications for the last 4 years. And 2 periods a day is very typical, probably even I think it's the most common number per day. So long story short, we felt pretty confident that this could be considered reflective of what would be representative on a training day. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say about the in-air noise. Okay, so let's switch to, so what's going on then underwater, where our hydrophone was recording. Again, here's our hydrophone spectrograms underwater. Instead of, and this is 3 1-hour periods, A, B, and C, on 3 different days that you're looking at. So instead of 4-hour period, you're now looking at a 1-hour period. We chose these panels or these hours because there was FCLP's activities scheduled during those periods. So basically we found a correspondence between this clustered activity that clearly looks like FCLP activity, where we have multiple aircrafts going overhead, within this 1-hour period. And then also there were examples of vessel traffic that we could sort of look at too. Now this study was absolutely not designed to compare vessel traffic with growlers. However, we are able to at least distinguish, demonstrate that there's a difference, right? So when we think about some of the typical types of vessel traffic, it's longer in duration and probably generally quieter. So these are short duration events, maybe can be louder depending on where you are proximate to the aircraft and how high in elevation it is. So the average underwater sound was 134 decibels. I know that doesn't mean anything to anybody, so I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. We were able to detect underwater FCLP activity when it was scheduled. And again, the sound signature, the duration, and the level it just differs from what vessel traffic would look like. I think that's everything about that. Okay, so here, this plot here was our attempt to try and place this environmental noise source into some ecosystem context or broader context. So what you're seeing here is we had to measure noise from when we could confirm that there was a single aircraft, because often there's multiple aircraft operating and that will make it louder, right? So we measured noise from when we could confirm there's just one aircraft here. And this is our distribution of those sound levels in air on the upper panel, and then underwater on the lower panel. And then against that, we have mapped, we looked through the literature, and we tried to do this in a way that was fair and consistent. And we looked through the literature for examples of studies that have found thresholds of either disturbance, stress, and avoidance for people. And then we tried to find what we considered representative terrestrial and marine wildlife. Now, I put an asterisk by that bullet point because you have to keep in mind that data of this type is not sitting around on every street corner. These types of studies are difficult, especially for wildlife studies, difficult to assess. We don't always have them a lot. And they're not always done in a way that can actually sort of establish this threshold, right? Noise is often studied. You then have, it's more work. Basically, it's more work to establish these thresholds. And what we found is that, the in-air noise exceeded thresholds for people, of course, and for all of the wildlife that we were able to find and evaluate. And then the underwater noise, you can see that the underwater noise exceeds thresholds of disturbance for some species. And this is well known. I mean, we know that noise does not impact species uniformly. We know that that's the case. That creates extra challenges too. You can't just sort of say that this noise source is okay and this one's not, right? It is sometimes species specific. And I think that we tried to capture this or convey this in this analysis. Okay, this is the last slide of the results. And then we just have summary and then I'll turn it over to Rob. So this is trying to capture this last thing that we did, this last analysis that we did was basically reviewing all of the other studies that we could find. Again, these are called military low altitude flights. And there have been other studies in the past worldwide that have looked at measured noise from this type of aircraft activity and then done some study either of impact on either communities, individuals in a laboratory, for example, or have done studies on different types of wildlife. I'm only showing you the graph or the information for people. There's another graph for wildlife in the paper, but it's actually, the patterns are very similar. And what we found is that when we did a tally, so extracted information from each of these studies, so each of these data points is from another study, or the one from Whidbey Island is shown there. We extracted the daily number of seconds above 100 decibels that the study reported. We extracted the maximum received level that study was sort of investigating or reporting. And then the number of flight events that study was investigating is shown by the size of the symbol. And, basically the difficulty or the challenge that we ran into is that here's Whidbey Island, what we measured, right? And we plotted that up against all of these other studies. And it bears the most similarity to a series of studies that were done around some of the Okinawan airfields about 25 years ago. But then here is all of the other studies, right? So this is the difficulty. If we want to say, go up and look up, what have other studies shown about increases in heart rate or increases in hypertension or something like that in response to this type of noise, either chronically or acutely, we're mostly looking at data, at studies that have evaluated either lower levels of noise or far fewer numbers of events on a daily basis. Now this is on a daily basis, right? The noise isn't every day, of course, but this was our contrast standardized on a training day or a daily activity. And so this just sort of, it rose the question of how do we even evaluate the impacts? And what was interesting is at the time, I knew that the Washington State Department of Health had done a literature review in 2017. What I didn't know, and I learned along the way, is that they also put a recommendation into the EIS, and they summarized it really well. And they said, the literature indicates that these types of impacts, health and well-being consequences, could be happening on Whidbey Island, but we don't really see a great way to get that information from the existing literature, and we think you should do a public health assessment. And I had to agree, after looking at these data, I had to sort of agree, that the Washington State Department of Health was correct. And that's always comforting. This is a sort of semi-quantitative approach. The Department of Health was a literature review, but we sort of came to the same conclusion independently. So that's my last result slide. And then I have conclusions, and I'll turn it over to Rob for a minute or two. The conclusions we drew from this study, the in-air and underwater noise levels, they exceed thresholds of disturbance and avoidance for all of the terrestrial creatures we looked at, including people. Sorry to call people creatures, and then some marine wildlife that were evaluated. We believed that this indicated that the implications of underwater noise from growlers probably warranted some further study, especially at larger spatial scales than, of course, what we did, which was at the most extreme point. And then the last one was that we couldn't find much evidence that comparable daily flight activity and impacts on health and well-being have really exist or have been evaluated very often, frequently before. And so we thought that this data supported those previous calls for a public health assessment to be done. Okay, I'm going to switch to the last slide and then I'll turn it over to Rob in case I missed anything or didn't get anything right, or I'm going to turn my video off. Well, I'll keep mine on. Oh, no, Rob?
Hi. Sorry, I have a warning that I have unstable internet, which doesn't sound good. But if you could go back a few slides, Lauren, thanks for summarizing that. I just feel like I can address a couple of the questions I've been seeing in the chat. If you share your screen.
Okay.
And go back to the deployment schematic.
Oops, there you go.
So let's start with that one first and just say, you know, a lot of our thinking on, you know, why we don't worry about airplane noise in the ocean, it really comes from some Cold War textbooks, physics textbooks, you know, 1962, that say, effectively, there is not very good propagation or transmission of noise across the air-water interface. It will just bounce off, and except in this very narrow cone underneath the flight path. And so people just hadn't bothered to measure it. And it's certainly true that as you have higher and higher, as you have more and more energy, that becomes more permeable. You are much more likely to be able to measure noise underwater. But if you're interested in this in the sort of Salish Sea writ large, you know, the choice of a study site to start was extremely deliberate. You know, if you imagine you're a small nonprofit, you've got a small budget to just go out and do this scoping exercise to say, is there any underwater noise? Is it big enough to worry about anywhere? You know, every time you're spending $4,000 or $5,000 on a piece of really expensive equipment, you don't want to throw it, electronic equipment, in salt water where you have little chance of measuring noise, or where you would struggle to be able to say definitively, that's the signal of a growler jet versus the signal of a ship or a boat. And so it made sense to start here right off the runway, frankly, because if you can't hear it there, then there's no point measuring anywhere else. So for those who are saying, yeah, it's not surprising that you're detecting it off the runway, absolutely, we agree. The point was, we as a community would have published the answer, even if we had done the study off the end of the runway. If we could not have detected it there, we would have reported that answer too. And so I think that's how science progresses, is that you start with a simple question, a simple study design, and you get, you know, more complicated, more sophisticated, more elaborate from there as the scale of the importance of the question and the funding that's available help you make some decisions. So that's that one. And I would say that the same holds true for how far offshore do you have to go before you no longer have to worry about it? How deep do you have to go before you no longer have to worry about this noise level? Or how high does the jet have to fly before you no longer have to worry about that? Those are great second round questions. But first, we had to demonstrate that you could hear the sound underwater. And sure enough, yes, you can. Someone was asking earlier about growler jets traveling in 3. I don't know what that sounds like in air on the Olympic Peninsula, but certainly underwater, when you're going through these recordings, you can certainly hear 3 discrete pulses of sounds of jets flying over the runways. So maybe it's easier to do that underwater than in air, but it's that was an interesting question. If you go at the next couple of slides, I think you had asked me about one more.
Oops.
About the thresholds.
There we go.
There you go. So yes, Lauren has already gone over what do these thresholds mean relative to terrestrial species and to people. I have more expertise in the marine species. But if you look at that histogram, those vertical bars, the gray bars, you'll see that, you know, these jets make a fairly stereotyped signature. And so even though you have 10 high quality recordings, they're all within this fairly narrow range of 130 to 136 or so, 138 decibels at the received level, even though the tide height may be quite different. And so they, you know, a lot of the variability may just be how much water is there between the jet and the hydrophone. What matters though is where are those gray bars relative to the red lines? And obviously, if no one has measured the noise of growler jets underwater, almost by definition, no one has any science on what is the impact of that noise on any, you know, other species. And so Lauren has talked about the need to use proxy species of animals when trying to make inference about, you know, you may have to look to studies that were done in Europe or Montana to try to find species where people have measured stress from, you know, in other taxa to try to make predictions about species that we care about here in the Pacific Northwest. In our case, we had quite a lot of good information about killer whales and harbor porpoise and some fish and sea lions that we care about in the Pacific Northwest, but we had to use different sound sources as a proxy because no one had ever measured the impact of growler jet noise underwater on marine wildlife. Of course, we had to use other proxies. And to the extent that we could, we tried to restrict our proxies to other things that make low frequency sound, things that are fairly chronic, like boat noise or ship noise. We tried not to use things that are, you know, impulsive sounds like mid-frequency sonar that can have, in addition to, you know, the disturbance effect, they can also have a really strong startle effect. But I think the point is, A, it's audible, you know, the energy propagates, it crosses that seemingly impermeable air-water interface. That's one result. Two is that enough energy propagates that it is audible to several species. And then the third result is, and the amount of noise energy is high enough that if it were coming from a ship or a boat, we would expect to see of a behavioral disturbance or over long periods of time, some form of stress. And I think as we go to other questions, I'd love to have some feedback from Todd on the call, who has a lot of experience with managing vessel traffic around southern resident killer whales. It would be interesting to see from a manager's perspective or from a management agency's perspective, what do you do with information like this when you have a novel, what seems to be to us a novel sound source, and the noise levels are above thresholds that we know could cause disturbance to other species? What do you do with that information? Now, certainly for our science, we could study this forever. We could put out 100 hydrophones throughout the Salish Sea. We could put them out on the Olympic Peninsula. We could fix tags to southern resident killer whales to see, well, does it care about whether the noise is coming from a jet or a ship? I think those become very difficult policy decisions and policy questions. Our intent was certainly at the beginning to just say, is there energy underwater? Is it loud enough to be perceived by some of the species we care about? And is it loud enough to potentially disturb some of those species? And I think having taken it that far, this is exactly the right kind of forum to have a discussion about what do you do with that information? Do you do more science, or do you say, hey, we're mitigating other noise generating activities in the area? Maybe this is something we should talk about mitigation as well.
Rob, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing.
That's great.
Okay.
That's all I had to say. And I can stop my video with my unstable internet.
Thanks to both of you. Rob, sounds like you need to do what I just did and put some more money into higher internet connection. The proverbial problem right now.
Oh, I have gigabit Ethernet. It just went out in our neighborhood.
Oh, shoot. Todd, Rob raised some questions about policies around this, and if you could just fill us in, or fill all of us in a little bit on what's been happening, addressing noise related to southern resident killer whales, and acknowledging that there's a difference between noise that's generated underwater versus that's coming from above water. But can you share with us a little bit about what's happening there?
Sure. Well, the Vessels Working Group and the Orca Task Force recognize that we're trying to find ways to mitigate for the disturbance and underwater noise of small vessels, large vessels, and this doesn't seem very far from it because it's creating underwater noise and potential for disturbance. I think in context, when we saw the disproportionate effect of speeding small vessels, boats on the underwater soundscape, Washington State was able to pass a law in 2019 that restricted the speed of boaters around southern residents to 7 knots or less, and created greater distance restrictions. And so that was one arena where we look for mitigation. We also turn to our partners up in Canada in the ECHO program, where they have voluntary measures for shipping slowdowns and lateral displacements and the like to bring down the potential for noise and disturbance, and have partnered with the maritime professionals to use something called the Whale Report Alert System, so that the professional mariners are made aware of whales, other marine mammals in their path, including southern residents. And the state has wanted to see the Navy use that Whale Report Alert System so that they can be informed during their training and testing exercises. A number of state agencies wrote a letter to the new Secretary of Defense and some of the Navy command to reiterate our understanding of the urgency to kind of get the use of the Whale Report Alert System into Puget Sound and have that as a tool. And so for Rob's question here, I can see pretty clearly the potential for overlap here. And so as we have a dialogue with the Navy on the use of the RAS for their vessel operations, I can see the translation of that into how they might use it in their air operations, and when the Whale Report Alert System detects southern residents in the vicinity, or we have other real-time notification of southern residents, there's the potential for mitigation there at Whidbey or the other places that the Navy operates. So I hope that gives you a sense of there's a spectrum of underwater noise sources and disturbance sources. We're trying our best to mitigate along in many different fronts, and that in this case, we are already seeing the potential, and the Navy has agreed in writing to try to incorporate the Whale Report Alert System into their operations, but we need to take the next steps in how that's implemented within the on-water operations, and maybe now in the air operations.
Thank you, Todd. Was the Navy part of the Orca Task Force, or they just responded to what came from the report that
Yeah,
came
they
out?
joined us in year 2. There was
Okay.
one thing we recognized: we didn't reach out to them early enough in year 1, and so they were part of our dialogue in year 2.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And if anybody has joined on since after we started, I just want to reiterate the fact that the Navy was invited to participate in this panel discussion several times, and we were disappointed that they're not with us. Lauren, there was a couple of questions related to the your slide with the graphic, and I wonder if you'd be willing to share your screen again. One question is, what does the bar graph indicate about whether killer whales can hear the Navy jets? And on that chart, what does the vertical axis represent?
So this is the graph, I think, that is a question.
Yeah.
So there's a part, and this is in the paper. It was kind of a little too in the weeds to show in this presentation, but there was a step in the paper where we actually do, so the way that while animals don't always hear the way we do, sometimes they're more sensitive to low frequency noise or higher, right? So our ears are sensitive between 1 and 5 kilohertz. Animals have sometimes different hearing sensitivities. The way that you determine is the sound audible is that you plot the noise source, and then you use what's called an audiogram for different wildlife. And if the audiogram is below the noise source, then it should be audible at these particular frequencies. So a whole step in the paper is we did that exercise, right? Is that we plot the noise source, and then we plotted the audiograms for the species that we had. And you can do this with lots and lots of species, but it's a little more like homework in a sense. So we did it for the 2 that are ESA listed, or their proxies at least. But it's going to be audible to a wide variety of wildlife. So we did do that part. It's in the paper where we show the audiogram of the orcas is below the sound signature, and the audiogram of a representative suite of seabirds for marbled murrelet is below that for both in air and underwater noise. And then on this one, the y-axis, this is it's called a frequency distribution or a histogram. So it's just the number of events. So what you're looking at is the distribution. We have a certain number of these aircraft events where we detected one, it's like, this is an aircraft event and this is the decibel level of that. And so we're plotting that as it's a frequency distribution. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Thanks for going back to that.
Do you want me to unshare now?
Yeah, you can unshare now and we'll all be on screen. And the issue of sort of mitigation, of dealing with some aspect of mitigation, what options are available and should be on the table? And that's open to anybody who thinks they have an answer.
Do you mean for, do you mean for the in air, or the, like, are you talking about Olympic Peninsula? I guess, is there a way to maybe make that question a little more specific, or?
Make it as specific as you have an answer for. It wasn't my question, so I'm,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think obviously in both studies, there's issues of sound that's up at a high enough level that it's of concern to humans in one case, as well as to marine life. When we talk about underwater noise, we can talk about the examples that Todd said, which is vessels can slow down, you can change propeller type, etc. It looks like Edmund might have something to offer for this question.
Yeah, I mean, usually when I think of control and mitigation, I like to think as upstream as we possibly can get. And so, controlling the source of the noise is always better than trying to figure out how to protect people or animals once the noise is out in the environment. And so, sometimes it's difficult to understand how much we can control a source, but from a practice standpoint, that's the most efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, communications from the Navy, and I'm looking at a couple of the letters that they provided, as well as the Seattle Times article. Clearly there's only certain areas that they can do this kind of training, and out on the Olympic Peninsula, it is a designated military operations area, MOA. We certainly understand that that's been in place for quite some time, and so yeah, I just wonder if there's other opportunities for reducing the impact to species, as well as including us as humans.
Ginny, just Just a quick response. I mean, in building on what Edmund said, which I completely agree with, there are operational measures that can be taken, which would involve changing the flight paths or changing the altitudes. But as you say, the Navy argues that it has thoroughly vetted these possibilities, including speaking to the FAA, and concluded that it can't modify its operations. And you can take that with as many grains of salt as you wish, but there seems to have been some process that the Navy has worked through. One approach that I, at least looking at the four square of the recent decision documents that were produced by the Navy and the National Marine Fisheries Service over NUT, Navy training and testing in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't see any discussion about the kind of mitigation I think Edmund is talking about, which is trying to engineer noise reduction at the source, and whether that could be done through retrofit in this case, or whether it's something that could only be done in the next generation of growler as part of a design specification. I don't know, but that should be an option. And along those lines, just to note, in the last National Defense Authorization Act, this is the one adopted, I think it was last December, there is a provision requiring the Department of Defense to report to the Armed Services Committees on a number of aspects of their use of military jets and the impact of those jets on public health and the environment. And one of the things they have to report on is what the Navy is doing to progress, or pardon me, what the Defense Department is doing to progress cost-effective technological solutions to mitigate the impacts of military jet noise. That's supposed to be, the report is supposed to be furnished to the committees by July 1st, I think, and I believe there's a provision that makes that report publicly available, though I have to go back and check on that. Anyway, that's something to look for and could potentially be the basis of some further outreach to the Hill, to Senator Cantwell's office, to try to push for progress in that area.
Thanks, Michael. And while we're going through these questions, there are so many in the Q&A box. I know some of the panelists are answering some as they go. If you're able to do that, that's one way we can begin to chip away at the pile. I wanted to raise the point that I had read that, and Rob brought this up, this is new science. Some of it's new science, some of it's newly emerging science. There's clearly more work to be done, but there are some regulatory processes that haven't acknowledged this new science when environmental impact statements are done and that type of thing. Is that a place where some changes and some of this new data could be brought to bear for changes?
I can comment. So actually the Olympic study was a preliminary version of it was done in time to be submitted to the environmental impact statement process. And so the Navy has responded to that work, which I have found to be instructive. In some ways, it defines some of their positions, I guess, around how it defines some of their positions on that. So, and that's, I'm happy to send that information, their responses in the EIS to this Olympic Peninsula study, which is great. I mean, I think that is the best way, is that when you can do the science and you can submit it as part of these environmental impact statement processes, that you can get these responses then that help define some of these positions. So I will say that I don't think the Whidbey Island EIS was completed earlier, and so of course it does not consider that work. But like I said, we concluded something similar to the Department of Health, who had submitted that information already. So that's all I've got on that. But
we've covered so much ground. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm hopping back and forth on stuff, but it's because we've covered a lot. And Edmund, I have a question for you, and wondering if you could discuss Washington's environmental health disparities map, and will include noise in the future.
Yeah, let me just, I noticed we've got Chicago, Illinois here and some other folks. So in Washington State, we developed a map over the last few years called the Washington State Environmental Health Disparities Map with some of our state partners and CBOs. And it's posted on the Department of Health's website. It's interactive and uses 19 different environmental indicators, and it consolidates them into a cumulative impacts ranking. Currently, so we have things like air pollution, sorry. We do not have noise currently. And we've certainly gotten a lot of requests to include noise. And there actually is a nationwide noise map put out by the Bureau for Transportation in the US. But if you look at it, it's actually deficient. So you'll, for this crowd, you'll notice sort of Whidbey Island and the naval base is completely not on that map. And so there are some concerns with including the available data. And so I think that's part of the reason why we haven't figured out what's the best way to include noise without there being some gaps in it, like we see it in the national map.
Thank you. It seems timely that we might also be talking about what the panelists feel are the most important research gaps and needs related to this growler noise. Anybody want to jump on that one? I know Rob has been talking about scarcity of resources and how to focus the work that they did in that last paper with what resources they had. What's the next one to do if you had the funds to do it?
Well, I mean, oh, sorry, you're gonna start in, Lauren. I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, for at least the second study on underwater noise, the primary question I have, and it just isn't surprising given the kind of response that I think you've already gotten to it from the Navy, and I think would get to it from the National Marine Fisheries Service, is its geographic relevance. You know, as you said multiple times, and for good reason, you were focusing on the extreme case, located the hydrophone right into the runway, so the question is to what degree can these results be extrapolated to other areas? What does the underwater noise influence of growlers look like elsewhere in the Salish Sea? I mean, that is a really critical question, because certainly the agencies have other means of discounting studies and finding data gaps as reasons to avoid undertaking mitigation. But here, I think you've got one of those data gaps right at the threshold that will keep any serious consideration by the Navy and NIMS from happening for that study. To the extent that you can, and I don't know whether you can, but model, do some kind of desktop analysis to model what the noise influence looks like elsewhere in the Salish Sea as the altitude increases, and that even that would be helpful. Although obviously, ideally, you would be putting hydrophones out and getting new data to use in your analysis. So there are other things as well, but I would, for that particular study, that's just a critical threshold study.
Let me jump in really quick. I could have mentioned this, or I feel like there's a need to mention this. So actually, the original study design it was supposed to include that. What we could not get was, if we had the aircraft data to go with the hydrophone data, we actually could have done at least a rudimentary kind of spatial analysis like that. We were not able to get that corresponding flight data, but if we had, I mean, it's not, I understand the reasons why we couldn't get it, but it doesn't, I don't think that it would require that much more information in order to do what you're suggesting. And that was actually our plan. It was one of those, I would talk about the logistical hurdles and barriers to doing this kind of research. And that was one of them. So I think that work could still be done, and it was part of our original plan. And Jenny, I guess I'll just go in and answer. I'll put in, the research that I think should be done. So I do think that both on the Olympic Peninsula and on Whidbey Island, I believe that this public health assessment, or the assessment on well-being and quality of life, needs to be done. Because right now it's just occurring in my inbox. Like, that's my email inbox, is people telling me they're impacted. And it would be wonderful to have, and it's still so anecdotal, right? I mean, some people are really affected, other people aren't bothered. I mean, there's just no, I wouldn't say we know now what the noise is like, we know what the noise levels are, we know when it's happening, right? Like, that kind of rudimentary stuff has been, well, we still don't, I mean, I don't see much data that has evaluated what impacts are occurring on people. And I think that needs to be done. So I think that's my only offering, actually, on where I would go next with this research. Oh, I will state, so the Navy is doing noise monitoring, right? They're doing a year of noise monitoring, and there will be data collected, and that data could certainly be repurposed for that type of assessment, or it could be a building block for that type of assessment to occur. So there's great quality data that's being collected right now. It just would need to be out into the open and usable, right?
Yeah, I'm really interested in Edmund's response. What your response to this question would be, knowing I think a lot of the work that's been done on the effects of civil aviation on humans, what that body of literature tells you about what should be done here.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I think civil aviation is very, very different from military aviation. The aircraft are different, the emissions are different, and so I think it's apples and oranges. Now, I know in email conversations with Lauren, I mean, she has sent me some documents of studies that have specifically looked at military aircraft and its health effects. And I think, the more that we learn about that, the more we'll be able to speak to the actual health effects in Whidbey Island and whatnot. I would caution, Whidbey Island, although it's certainly an impacted community, there aren't huge populations there. And so designing a human health study just for Whidbey would be a bit challenging, just because the numbers, it's like doing a cancer cluster analysis where, you're looking for a needle in a haystack, or if everyone's exposed, then what's your contrast? And so I think, perhaps there's some other military bases around the country that have similar issues that need to be looked at collectively. And that would give you statistical power, enough people to actually look at human health effects. So those are the two ideas that come to mind.
Thank you. There was a question that came in, and I've got these stacks of questions everywhere. So I'm going back to the ones that came in when people originally registered. And there was one about low frequency noise. And the difference between that with a person saying that it's that shakes their house. So it's not making them deaf, but it is disturbing them and really provoking what I'll use the word anxiety. That vibration is detrimental. And I wonder if you could speak to that. This person says it makes them feel unhinged.
So there's a lot there. I actually responded to one of the questions earlier, the psychoacoustics question about people's perceptions around noise are actually really important.
Yeah.
And so, what people think about the source of the noise and whether or not they feel like they have control over it is also very, very important. And I think it goes to this as well, to have your entire house rattle and shake clearly suggests that you don't really have control over this noise source. And then secondary, there's actual physics involved. And so our bodies have resonant frequencies, and low frequency noise rattles our bones. And so that is yet another concern that we have within the whole body vibration is a concern, because it's noise and sound and vibration. It's all the same thing.
Yeah, and this comment was coming from somebody on Lopez Island, so in the San Juans. We've talked specifically about the Olympics, where the first study was done, and on Whidbey, but we've also identified the fact that clearly San Juan Islands are in this flight path, not part of the military operation area, and yet very much affected by it. So that, I think, creates a conundrum of for tackling in a little bit different way. For sure. Rob, you look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, I loved what you just said there, Ginny. I don't think the people who live on San Juan Island would ever consider themselves as people who live in flyover country. But effectively, they do live in flyover country between Whidbey and the Olympic Peninsula. And I think Michael's suggestion that it would be good to know the geographic, spatial, and temporal extent, and also with altitude. At what point does this received noise level become negligible? I mean, on the one hand, yeah, of course, that is absolutely the next step. I think the question becomes, whose job is it to pay for that study? Is the onus on sort of the conservation community or the community at large? People have been asking questions about citizen science. Is it the citizens' job to do this kind of work, or is it sort of in any other context we'd be talking? It would be reasonable to expect the Navy to pay for underwater monitoring, just like they're doing now in air. But you could do some hybrid stuff. As my dog is suggesting, that we could try to put maybe not 10 or 100 hydrophones out, but maybe 3 or 4. And I would say it would be great to get some citizen science on if we can map those noise complaints, which you've probably already done, to see where do the people hear growler jet noise in places where they're near killer whales. And I would think the very southern tip of San Juan Island is probably an area that you might want to go to next. If the next step is only 1 more hydrophone, I think that's reasonable. I think that's a useful next step. That modeling study that you've talked about, could you create a sound field map of the Salish Sea, or the contribution of growler jet noise to the Salish Sea sound field map? That's a pretty expensive ask, because you'd need to know not only, yes, it does contribute underwater noise, but here are the factors that govern the noise in terms of the altitude and the depth of the water and the sediment type and all those other things. So that strikes me as a bit more ambitious. But ultimately, I think what we want, those of us who are concerned with conservation of killer whales, I think what we'd love to do is to be able to produce a sound budget in the Salish Sea that includes small boats and ships and nature, wind and waves and all that good stuff. But to have the Navy, both in terms of their ships, their fleet, and their planes, it would be interesting to how big is their slice of pie in the overall ambient ocean noise budget in the Salish Sea. And it may be that it's it's trivial, but that would be good to know, because we're also, as Todd mentioned, we're also asking other sectors who have a trivial contribution to Salish Sea ocean noise to mitigate their impacts. People with, a skiff with a 9-horse outboard. We're asking kayakers to mitigate their impacts on killer whales. So I think it would be good to have that sort of information on the relative importance of various sectors. And what makes the Navy sector unique, of course, is that they are the repository. They know how to build the world's quietest ships. And so there may be a potential for some knowledge transfer. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could learn from the Navy how the commercial sector could be building more fuel efficient or quieter ships and quieter dogs?
I know that they are capable of doing things. I had heard about the Navy developing alternative fuels. It was really interesting. It's been noted that there are hydrophones. There are networks of hydrophones on both the Washington, and I'm familiar with British Columbia having a network of hydrophones. So perhaps there's some partnering opportunities here for systems that are already in place.
Yeah, but I think it's absolutely a great point, but it comes back to the issue that Lauren raised, which is the acoustic data alone are not as valuable as the combination of visual observers, observers watching visually, and underwater recordings. And so out in the middle of the Strait of Georgia, where we've got great hydrophone networks thanks to Ocean Networks Canada, we also need to be able to map that and line it up in space and time with known overflights. If you were doing this acoustically, it would be quite a big task to be able to say that's a jet, a growler jet versus a commercial jet versus a boat. We can build detectors to do that if you have high quality subsets of the data where you have people and underwater listening stations, and you can develop signatures and then train your computer to go through and search for that pattern. You can do that. The other thing is that, at our nonprofit at Oceans Initiative, we have started a citizen science underwater, like acoustic prospecting toolkit. We built a bunch of very affordable hydrophones with recording systems. I think people could buy them for about $1,200. And if you're just drifting in your boat in the Salish Sea, you could be measuring ambient noise samples. We want to get people listening for fish and listening for whales. But if there are places where growler jets are flying by, flying overhead, you could, if you had the system in the water and it's recording, and you're willing to just stay there and put your earplugs in, we could get some information on the spatial and temporal extent of the underwater contribution, or the contribution of growler jets to underwater noise throughout the Salish Sea. But it's a lot of work to process the data. I think Lauren made a great first start putting the issue on the map or on the nautical chart, so to speak, because it's underwater. I think where do we go from here? Several directions. B as a community, C as the priority. And I think that's why I'm really I love these great comments we're seeing in the Q&A.
Thank you, Rob. You brought up the issue of cumulative impacts, and that sure is top of mind. When you specifically think about what's happening with the southern resident killer whales and all that's affecting their health right now, a little bit of additional disturbance is an exacerbating issue. When we're looking at the first paper that we talked about from flights over the Olympic Peninsula, it's a different frame. So I do really want to appreciate that we're covering a lot of territory over this symposium. And given that, I want to just allow any one of the panelists, every one of the panelists, if you want to just, we're getting close to our signing off time here. And I wondered if you feel like there's something that you wanted to add to the conversation that you haven't had a chance to do. Lauren?
I do, and it's part of a conversation, and it's maybe part of a question too, is that one thing that I have found challenging about this issue is that it's very, I don't want to sound critical. I can think of many, many reasons why the Navy's not able to participate in dialogues about these kind of things readily. Science tends to be a far more open process in general. And so as a researcher, you're used to, in other contexts, you're used to being able to share data, you're used to being able to talk with government scientists, you're used to being able to sort of just phone people up and ask them what's up, right? And those opportunities, like I said, I don't want to sound critical because I can think of 100 million reasons why the Navy can't do those things, right? It makes progress more challenging on these issues. And so I guess I'm wondering if, again, I bring it up as an issue. It's a reality that I believe needs to be considered, well considered. It's really easy to say, well, we should just do a study on this. But knowing that you won't be able to access the information or potentially the expertise that has that. So if other panelists can weigh in on similar situations, that's great. But I do want to just raise that as a reality of making progress here. So that's all I have.
Can Lauren, I have just in response to that. I mean, I think it's a great point. We've encountered the same issue before in multiple contexts involving science and policy as well. I think our experience has been that you can't take a bottom-up approach. Or I should say that if you take a bottom-up approach, if you try to work with folks who are lower level within the Navy in order to reach some agreement for some kind of data sharing, there is a pretty good likelihood that you won't eventually get that data because I think in general within the Navy, folks do not like to stick their necks out. And I think it's even more the case for the military than it is for civilian agencies. And at some point up the chain, someone who is not involved in the discussions you had there's a likelihood that somebody's going to say no. Our experience has been that things have been more fruitful when we've been able to take more of a top down approach. In this case, well, it raises a question of how can you do that here? And again, one tool that I would recommend is looking at the congressional delegation for Washington State and having them weigh in and see if they can get some commitment. I just think that that's more likely to bear fruit.
Thanks, Michael. Other sort of closing comments from panelists? Oh, Rob, go ahead.
No, well, this is very, very quick and 2 seconds. Francis, someone in the comments asked about or mentioned a San Juan County reporting form for do you hear growler jet noise? And I don't know if that goes to you or Christina Coons may know something about that, but if that's a data set that could be accessed and mapped, obviously anonymized, that would be helpful for outlining next research steps. But I want to hear what Michael has to say.
Oh, and there's Francis.
Would you like me to? I can't answer that personally. It's not an area of my expertise, but I can certainly find out that information and share that with anyone who's interested in finding out about that data.
Great, thanks.
And I'll also just point out there's a few things that we brought up. I had mentioned the Seattle Times opinion piece from Captain Arnie, and we didn't have it at our fingertips as I thought, so it didn't end up in the chat, but we'll include it. Everyone who attended will get a wrap-up email, and we'll include that link in there. And if there's other things that we were missing that people are seeking, we'll try to get that out as well along in the same thing.
Jenny, just to make my point, which is really, really brief, in all my years of doing this underwater noise work, and particularly the piece having to do with the military, I think one of the most resonant things I've heard was from a member of the California Coastal Commission during a hearing when the Navy was present, and what that person said was that the Navy, just in the case of Southern California, in the opinion of the commission, just wasn't being a good neighbor. That they weren't the only entity down in Southern California, that there were a whole lot of people there who were affected in one way or another by the Navy's activities, whose livelihoods and otherwise just weren't figuring in the Navy's plans. And to me, this is just given the response in the Seattle Times, given the lack of engagement in the seminar, to me, this is just another such situation where, for one reason or another, the Navy isn't being the neighbor it should be. It's a simple thing to say, perhaps, but can't help but feel that.
Well, I really want to thank everybody. Todd, did you see you got your hand up?
Well, I just thought I wanted to provide more evidence of optimism, or more room for optimism here. I know that in the evaluation of the last training and testing proposal from the Navy, it assimilated the public comments. The state communicated some concerns with places they were, nighttime operations, and we saw changes in the final plan as a result. And in this study, we, the latter one that Lauren and Rob presented, we finally have some definitive answers as to, does sound penetrate at depths that might be heard by southern residents and marbled murrelets? And we have an answer to that question. The extent to which that may happen over the Salish Sea and overlap with those endangered species may remain to be seen, but I think it will help us advocate for the Navy to incorporate that sort of modeling in future proposals to NOAA and NIMS. And I'm hoping in that constructive spirit, we will also see them, find the opportunity to, look for mitigation opportunities within that whale report alert system.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Thanks to everybody who participated as a panelist and speaker. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I've learned quite a bit over the course of the last 2 hours. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. We had over 230 people, I think, at the high point of our talk here. This webinar was recorded and will be available in a few days to everyone who participated and anyone who may have missed it as well. So thanks so much for being here, and have a good evening, and take care.
Thank you all.
Good night.